Here's our young new people today. So I'm going to do it alphabetically, right? Wave your hand in case people don't know you. Coulter. That's Kevin, representing the Coulter family. Fry. Colin, representing the Fries. Plummer. John. Pollard. Jenny, now asleep. Probert. Adrian and Rolly. John. So we're trying to cover a breadth of families that we haven't tackled so far. Our approach is we've got a few loose questions that we'll start with, and then we'll just flow along with the talking. We'll talk for about an hour and then we'll stop and have a break. Have some coffee and tea. You can buy a raffle ticket there. And we'll have coffee and tea, and then we'll come back for another hour or so at the end, so that'll give them a rest in the middle. Some of them have been saying, oh, I don't know what to say. I don't think we're going to have any problem with these guys talking. So, let's start now, and the first question is really loose and just about your family, and I'm actually going to start at the far end and work down the list here. I'll bring a microphone over to you. So the first question is, can you tell us a little bit about the Rowley family and when you came to the district, and probably why, if you know why, you came to the district?
Sorry. Stop waiting. Is that okay? We're okay?
Yeah.
Well, the question that was posed I didn't know the answer to. So that, with a bit of help from my young sister Marilyn, we've worked out an approximate time that the Rowley family came to the district. Joe Brodie, my great-grandfather, they had 5 children, all born in the Encounter Bay and Yankalilla district. 3 of which we think came up with them to this part of the woods. My grandfather Fred is the one member of the family where we don't have a birth registration for. We know he was born in 1875, but we don't know where. Then there was Ted, or Edmund, George, Louis and Agnes. Edmund was born 1877 at the Tiers near Loberthal in the Nan district. George, 1879, born Chain of Ponds, Tolunga district. Louis, 1881, birth registered at the Tiers Nan district. And Agnes, 1884, birth registered Stony Creek in the Nan district. We know that Job had lost the lower part of his arm in a reaping machinery in Yankalilla, and we understand that he came to this area. Well, we think it's about the mid-1870s, which is 3 members of the family born Yankalilla way, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 born up in this part of the world. He was a shepherd for Morris Price on Castonville Station, and we understand the family lived in a slab hut near the stone hut over the top of the hill. So we think about the mid-1870s. In 1883, Joe Broley of Stony Creek purchased part section 63, the 100 of Onkaparinga, 18 acres for £95, which I understand is where John Plummer grew up. So that was the family's first acquisition of property in the district.
Thank you. John?
Thank you, Joe. Can everyone hear? Edward Plummer arrived in South Australia in 1840. We have a photograph of him taken in 1840, and that appears in a mosaic that was produced by Duray of the 1840 colonists of South Australia. That photograph is now in the Mortlock Library for everyone to see. In 1841, Edward was recorded as living on government farm off of Cumnock Hill Road in the South Australian census of 1841. I believe that Edward lived most of his life in that area because over the following 40 or 50 years, the Plumbers lived in that area, owned some of the land in that area, along with the Thompson family. Charles Plummer, my great-great-grandfather, was born in that area, and along with, I believe it was 10 other children, one being deceased, so there's 9 descendants. Just going back to Edward Plummer, he married Emma Hancock. And as I said, they had 10 children, one being deceased. Charles being my great-grandfather, being one of those descendants. Edward died in 1888 at the age of 80. He, along with Emma Hancock, or Emma, his wife, were buried in the Inverbrackie Cemetery. Charles Plummer, my great-grandfather, also lived on Cumnock Hill Road, and I believe there are still remnants of the old Plummer house down the valley off of Cumnock Hill Road. 3 Plummer boys married 3 Thompson daughters. Thompsons lived across the road, they owned land there. Plumbers were on the right-hand side of Cumnock Hill Road. Charles married Elizabeth Thompson. As I said, they lived on Cumnock Hill Road, but in 1897 they took up what was known as Givendale, nearly 200-acre lease there, and my grandfather always told me as a boy, I asked where he was born, he always said I was born at Givendale, and at the time I had no idea where Givendale was, but over the years through history groups and we've been able to glean the knowledge that that's where he was born. They leased, as I said, nearly 200 acres there for 3 years, and in 1900 they took up a lease on what is now Plummer Road. It was a Crown lease, and they raised, I think it was 10 children, one of those being my grandfather Horace. I don't know how far you would like me to proceed.
That's probably a good spot at the moment. Thank you. So before you start, Kevin.
Yeah.
So if you live in Lenswood or Forest Range, you're probably related to somebody else who lives in Lenswood or Forest Range. And equally, you're probably living on land that someone else's family lived on, or you've bought someone else's land now. So when we're talking about plumbers leasing Givendale, John's family and my family, after plumbers had left, both had parts of Givendale itself. So relationships flow. Now, so far, have we hit any cousins? Not yet. I don't think so. I've tried to be really careful and not get too much inbreeding on this table. However, all right, Kevin.
Hey?
Hey.
There are some cousins in my family. Okay, anyway, so the Coulters. Now, I don't know if people know, but in Scotland, halfway between Glasgow and Edinburgh, there's a place called Coulter. It's like a little little place, small village, and they're not aligned with any clan. But I figured they just come out of the hills and they go and, you know, pillage and do their things, then disappear into the highlands again, as Coulters would do. But it turns out that the Coulters were farmers from Kent, southern England, very, very docile kind of area. And I don't think they were particularly well off, because they actually came to South Australia in 1840. So arrived at Port Adelaide 17th of June 1840. And at the time there was a lot of poverty in England, so I think probably the Coulters took advantage of having free passage to the colony and being able to work here and help the colony get going. So there was my something great-great-great-grandfather John and his wife, and they had 6 children, 4 boys, one of whom I'm descended from. But also he had 2 brothers that came with them as well. And one of the brothers had 6 children. So they came out in a ship called the Charles Kerr. So they arrived in South Australia, Port Adelaide, and it seems that they went to, it was called Upper Dry Creek, which is I think around Tea Tree Gully area. And I was kind of trying to look up some stuff about that. And it turns out that William Coulter is who I'm descended from, but his brother Reuben became a constable, like a police officer in the area at Tea Tree Gully, and he was in charge of the local pound. So there are stories in the Tea Tree Gully council meetings of how he said, "Oh, I've got this bay mare, such and such height and stuff, and if it's not collected, it'll be auctioned off on such and such a date." And the Coulters actually bought some land in that area. So Reuben, for example, there's a record that he bought 268 acres, I think, in the early 1870s at Tea Tree Gully. So the Coulters were there, but William, who would have been about 14 when he arrived in South Australia in 1840, he must have gone off and become a timber cutter, because in 1869 he actually bought some land up on Edwards Hill Road, and it's still in the family today, basically. One of my sons lives in an old house there. I'm not sure when it was built, Evelyn, but I don't know. But I suspect some of the walls there are pretty old. So William was a timber cutter, and he, for some reason, put the land in his son's name. Did you notice that? He had a young son, and instead of, he bought the land from someone called Wood, which is a bit ironic, timber cutters. And so got the land there, and gradually they've sort of bought up more land. His 2 sons, one was James, and then there was another John, who was my great-grandfather, bought some land across the road, and then that's been sort of passed down through the family as well. When John passed away, he left some of the land to my grandfather, Bert Coulter, Albert Harrington, and some to his other son, Len. So it's sort of been in the family. Parts of it have been sold off. I've got 2 brothers that still live up there now on parts of the property. But yeah, it was, I guess we talk about, but where they lived was pretty rough, actually. So, but and one of my sons lives up there as well, so we've still got family connections up there. And they've sort of, through the years, they've maintained this tradition of working in the timber industry, really. cutting down trees, deforesting the state. But supposedly they were gardeners anyway. So, is that enough for them?
Yep, that's what it is. Colin.
I'm a great-grandson of the first prime that arrived in South Australia, John Brock Fry. He was born in Broadstairs in Kent in 1834. His father passed away at 15. He left school and was working in bakery, and then he joined the British Navy. His first ship was the Apple, and that was working down around Africa, chasing slave ships, trying to free the slaves. And then from there he went to the battleship the Colossus, and he went to the Crimean Wars. When he finished there, he joined the Merchant Navy, and he arrived in South Australia in 1857, in September. But by December, he had deserted the ship, and the ship, I think, is still waiting for him to come back. And he worked around the state, different areas, Tunkillo and all that, until he was in the Lower Light area, and he met the Brown family. And subsequently, when they moved back to the hills, he followed and married Harriet and Dawn. They had 6 children. The oldest son didn't survive after about 20. The rest were, the only other son was my grandfather. And then in the later years, he was working as a timber cutter and sawyer. And in later years, he joined up with Henry Green, who by that time was his brother-in-law. And they bought a block of land, which is now the Lenswood shop and the coal store there. After about 13 years, they split it in halves, and the Fryers kept the top half, and the Greens from the bottom half in those days. I think there was a small house or some cottage on the top block. I'm not sure what the Greens had, but just a slab hut, probably. And that's where they lived for many years, until later years they built a substantial home by Alexander Brockhoff, the stonemason, built the house. He was in the timber business for many years, and then he had health problems. So they were looking for a school teacher, and he put in for the job, and he worked at the original school up just next to where, on Coastal Road, next to Norton's, used to be Norton's property, and then they built a new one on the main road here, and for 30 years he was the headmaster.
All right, cool. Thank you.
I'd like to thank my brother Ivan, who's done all this research years ago, so all I had to do was ask him to send me a little bit of information, so it's very easy. The Probert family came from Wales, near Herefordshire, and the Probert name in Wales is a bit like Greens on Coastal Road. They're everywhere. John and Charlotte Probert, they were newly married and migrated from Turnestone, Herefordshire in 1857. They ran a dairy farm on Churchill Road at Dudley Park. That was near the railway station and the cemetery, and there's a plaque near there that memorialises it today. Peter Phillip, his son, moved to Mylor and lived at the junction of My Road, and he was known as the Strawberry King. His nearest neighbour and good friend was G.W. Goyder, which was the Surveyor General. We all know about him. His son, William Oliver, was my grandfather. he married Elizabeth Mary Polly Brown, and they produced 3 boys, 3 girls, and then 3 boys, youngest of whom was my father, William. Oliver was born at Mylor. I went to the Mylor Primary School. It was built in 1851, and he became a charcoal burner and timber contractor. Charcoal was in highly demand by blacksmiths. There was 3 blacksmiths in Summertown, just for information, and they were used for fires, and they produced very, very hot wood, very high heat. And they used stringy bark, was primarily used because of its straight grain, and it burned very well and made good charcoal. My grandfather bought property at Forest Range on Deviation Road in 1913 off a bloke called Percival, who was bought the property for timber, and he was a property developer and entrepreneur. Property has remained in the private family name up until just recently, when my brother sold it to my cousin, who was a Leeville, and the Leeville family came out in 1836 and were the first settlers at Harndorf. So, and they were the first immigrants to come to this country to escape religious persecution because they were Lutherans. Thank you.
Thank you. Can I just ask a question on that Leeville cousin? Is that Leeville cousin related to the, no, I can't remember her name, but the Leeville lady who married one of our World War I? Because she was related in some way to Ivan.
Yes, my great uncle.
Lord Lacey Lawson.
My great uncle was killed in the First World War. My mother was a Leeville, and her mother was a Trinorden.
Right, yeah. Starting to get tentacle. Charcoal's a tentacle we will explore in more.
Brothers married sisters and so on.
I think as long as we don't have any Thompsons in the room, we're okay. All right, Jenny.
Thank you. Hi, I have a few gaps after listening to all of you. I've got a few gaps in my family history knowledge, but I can go back about 5 generations to the Pollards when they first came to Forest Range. It was Joseph Pollard, he had come out from Somerset in England as a younger child with his family, and he had married Susanna, who also had come out from Lincolnshire, but they'd come out separately with their own families. And they married in about 1870, and they actually settled in the Mount Barker district area. And eventually they moved, around about 1895 I think it was, they moved to Forest Range. They moved to the corner of Lobethorn and Smith Road, where the goldfields had been. And they came there. Joseph came as a blocker. He would have leased the land from the government, I'm thinking, or something like that, and then he bought some land, and his property was there on the corner of Smith and Lobethorn Roads. And so they became farmers, and it was apparently really incredibly hard to work and farm that land because of where the gold diggings had been, and that had really obviously made a big mess of the soil, so it was really hard work. But they did that, and they managed to produce a good farm, and it was quite productive. And then one of their sons, who's also known as Joseph, he was my father is Harold. Was Harold Pollard. One of their sons was my dad's grandfather. And then their son Joseph married Julia Shepherdson, who in 1894, they stayed in Forest Range and lived there. I don't know where they lived. I have not been able to find that out. But they lived in Forest Range somewhere. And then Joseph and Julia, eventually they moved the property on Collins Road, which is where I grew up. That property, when belonged to the East family. My grandmother, who was Della Pollard, who was Roy's wife, was the only child in her family, and so she eventually inherited all of that property as East land. And that's where Dad grew up, with Roy and Adela as his parents, and where I feel like I grew up there in that house. We lived just a little bit further down the road, but that was a big part of my life in that land. They had, Roy came from a family of about 11 children, so there was a big family. And yet, interestingly, Della came from a family with she was the only child. But there's also that connection, so that's the Pollard family, but there's also the connection with the East family, of course, because, you know, my grandmother was an East. And they married her parents, James and Mary, they married in 1863 in Balhannah. And then James married Mahala, who was one of their sons. So they lived on Collins Road, and so for me, I feel there's a very strong connection, obviously with a big connection, actually, a fifth generation Pollard, I suppose, and then also, if I really work it out correctly, a fifth generation East almost, even though I'm not an East, but from that family. So there's a strong connection to Forest Range.
So that piece of land that the Pollards bought, the Plumbers have just sold that piece of land, and when the Pollards bought it, the government had bought it from my family, the Boards. Yeah. And so I imagine when he came there farming, because I know still on the piece of land that I live on, everything's upside down. All the rubbish is on the top because it was turned over for gold. And all the good soil is gone. I don't know where it's gone, but it's not on my land. And it probably would have been much the same along the creek. I remember there is a story, I think Jeffrey might have put it in Stringy Barks to Orchards, about when Pollards were there first, they lost a horse down a mine shaft. Somewhere there's a story about losing the horse down the mine shaft. And how terrible that was, because they could not afford to lose this horse. Exactly. Disastrous, yeah, exactly. Yeah. All right, so we're going to go around the circle again. Make sure on the way through this circle that the two families who were involved in charcoal burning, do you know anything about charcoal burning? The two families that were involved in charcoal burning say something about charcoal burning, but on the way through this time, I want you to talk about the type of industry that they involved in when they came here. So right back, your grandparents, your great-grandparents, even your parents, what were they doing? Were they growing apples? Were they growing swedes? Were they being a shepherd? All that type of thing. What do you know, John?
Oh. Yeah, thank you. Other than the originally up at the Stone Hut being shepherded, and I understand that Castonville Station went from Castonville down the Gorge Road to cover a lot of territory, and pretty rough territory. So, and the boys, when they were young, I've read something where they would walk and mine stock as far as Charleston, Mount Torrens. So I'm not sure how big a property Castonville Station was, but because the great grandfather had one arm, he was limited to what he could do. But when they acquired property at Stony Creek, and I'd like to get some of these Stony Creeks, another name, Jerry's Flat, and so on. If people can throw a bit of light on that, that'd be good too. As I understand it, they were on that property at Forest Range. They grew fruit and vegetables. My great grandmother cooked and supplied meals to the miners. The gold was running at the time, and I can remember my grandfather telling me, grandfather Fred, that the family used to make ginger beer, and that was something that was done in those days, and each child got so many bottles of ginger beer. But my grandfather was a bit careful with his money, and he didn't drink his, he sold it to the miners. So, but so they were there on that property. My grandfather, Fred, acquired a portion of Givendale in 1910 or thereabouts, when his family, which was the start of our family, and then his younger brother Ted took over the Forest Range property, and I think my great grandfather then, he had a home at Maylands in the city, and went down there. So essentially it's been farming and as is typical in the area.
Now, I just want to ask a question, and John may in fact know the answer as well anyway. So Rollies, when they were cooking for the miners, were basically in a house somewhere near the house that John grew up in. Do you know exactly where that house, John, do you know where the previous house was there?
Well, I'm only assuming, I wasn't aware of the Rolly connection. My grandfather and father bought the property where I grew up in 1947, and they bought that from Constance Mason, sorry, and she was a widow. So prior to that, I don't know the history apart from what I've read in the Stringy Barks to Orchards edition.
I think that property was sold in 1910. So there's a big gap there, John.
Yes, it is. So yeah, no, that's the only light I can throw on the house. But that particular house was a very old house, and it was a pug house. It was just made with clay and timber, and that's where we were not born, but where we lived our early childhood years until about 58 when my grandmother died. So but just going back to Jenny's story about the mines that the Pollards owned on Smith Road. Ian can relate the story about those mine shafts. You said the family lost a horse in the shaft. Well, we nearly lost a tractor. We had that planted to orchard in the late 1990s, and after a couple of particularly wet winters, all those shafts sank, and you'd go spraying through there in spring, and all of a sudden the wheel would drop into a shaft. So yes, I can relate to that story. Just going back to
still happening too.
Just going back to Plummer's history, I believe Edward was a timber cutter initially off of Cumnock Hill Road. We don't have very much history about what else they did. Probably when Charles Plummer came to Plummers Road in 1900 is the first stories that we learn about their history. Anyone who knows that block on Plummers Road, it was a pretty rough, steep, hilly block. It would have been pretty tough going. The front hill, which is still covered in scrub, is pockmarked with quarries, diggings for stone. When we were children, there was a tunnel down closer to the creek which went into the hillside, and I can only assume that was used for digging for gold. And on the very top of the hill there was also another quarry, that obviously was used for stone, taking stone out. But I imagine all these things happened well before 1900. The family, I believe the first orchard that my great-grandfather planted was in 1914, and I don't know how big a plot of land had been cleared. I imagine it would have been felled for timber prior, when it was Crown land, but it still would have been pretty rough country to clear. I know down around the flats near the house, the very old house that was there, they grew vegetables, and like a lot of people in this district were market gardeners. They grew vegetables, berries, apples, and other fruits. They were mostly market gardens. They weren't specialised in any particular one crop. So, not sure if that's where you...
Thank you. Now, I'll just point out while I'm up and down here, on the wall we've got some photos. This is Edward, so this is the one that Don was talking about earlier. That photo is from the...
That's correct. All right, do you don't want me to go further?
At the moment, no. We'll go on to the Coulters.
Yes. Okay, so the
Industries and...
industries and things like that, yes. Well, I guess like William Coulter was the one that is the ancestor that was living out Edwardsville Road, and I presume that he was still involved in timber cutting. Don't really know a lot of details about him, but he had two sons. There was James and also John, who was my great-grandfather. And they, like I said before, they had properties like either side of Edwards Hill Road, and any kind of government records and things say that they were gardeners, I think. So John Coulter and James Coulter are listed as gardeners, so they were basically growing vegetables and things like a lot of other people around the place, I guess. I can sort of remember when I was very young that Dad used to go and visit his family, and there was one of my grandfather's brothers, Len, they used to call him Pat Coulter. He had a property just up past Joyce's at the end of the straight, and there were a lot of old trees there. I remember the size that the trees used to be, so we'd drive down the driveway and across the creek and up to the house, and there was these huge fruit trees growing along there. But my grandfather, Bert, who lived up almost around towards Anderson Hill, the side of Anderson Hill, and where Prancard Road goes, and he had a property in the corner up there, and he tried a number of different things. At one stage he was an apiarist, so he had beehives and took them up the river, but he had some bad luck. I think there was drought and bushfires and things, so wiped out his hives. He also grew vegetables as well, like on the flat sort of area up there. They seem to be able to grow peas and beans and things right through December. So I think in those days it must have been damper up there. But he also, I think in the early 1930s, he became a charcoal burner, didn't he? Got into the charcoal burning, and Joe's got a couple of photos over there of the Coulter family lined up alongside one of their kilns for slow burning the wood to make the charcoal. And I didn't really know much about this until a few years ago when you brought it up, because the family never really talked about those sort of things very much, like about the past. It was just living sort of in the present. So so that's those people, and then we've kind of had involvement in the timber industry. Like my father was a woodcutter. Before I started primary school, we used to live up Hollands Creek Road between Cudley Creek and Lenswood, a place called Snake Gully, call it for a good reason. So and Dad he would take his axe out and he'd go and cut down the trees, and the landscape certainly changed a lot down there You know, in the old days there were stringy barks everywhere, but now there's very few stringy barks down through there. So yeah, he was, and even like there was Uncle Ned as well, Dad's brother. He always worked in timber and worked in a sawmill down Mount Bold. And the only time he could hear you talking was if there was a loud screeching noise going. If it was quiet, he couldn't hear a thing. So that's sort of what we've been doing. Is that?
Cool. Yep. Now, Colin, would you mind if I skip you and we come back? Because I want to stay on the timber story, given we've got the prover, and then we'll come back.
Thanks, Joe. As I said before, that John and Charlotte had a dairy, that, and they called it Hereford, and they delivered milk to North Adelaide, so all the rich people in North Adelaide could have some milk on their cornflakes. And my great-grandfather, he was a market gardener and known as a strawberry king. But my grandfather, William Oliver, he started out burning charcoal. And charcoal there's a picture of a charcoal heap there being burnt. You use stringy bark and you heat it up in a cone shape with a chimney up the centre, and you either covered it with earth, and sometimes you put tin and earth, and you had to light a fire underneath, and you had to maintain that fire 24 hours a day until the charcoal was burnt. If it got too much air, all you'd be left was a heap of ash. And if you didn't have enough air, it wouldn't burn. So stringy bark was good for that because it had a straight grain and it made good charcoal. And they used to bag it up, and there's a picture at the Forest Range post office of my grandfather's charcoal truck, fully laden, ready to go for sale. My grandfather contracted Heaths and Coulters to burn charcoal for them, and he sold a lot of charcoal for them. After charcoal burning, or while he was doing charcoal burning, he went into a timber industry where he cut logs. He used to cut logs, contract from farmers who wanted their property cleared, so he'd cut the logs, and he supplied pylons that went under to Port Adelaide Wharves. The Goolwa Barrage, which was about 6 miles long, they drove 60-foot pylons into the ground like a crosshatch because the ground was too soft, so that they could use that as the base for the concrete for the Goolwa barrages. The timber was loaded on at either Aldgate Railway Station or Charleston, because the train used to run through Charleston through the back of Oakbank High School, and I can remember the last train that went past the high school there. So they supplied, and my father supplied the last lot of pylons for the Patalunga barrage. And the poles had to be straight as a die and no branches for the first 60 feet, and the top end had to have a diameter of 14 inches.
Great-grandfather came in the district as a timber cutter and sawyer, and then, as I said later on, the health problems, he was the school teacher. But his son, my grandfather, was John Brock II, and the Brock came from my great-grandfather's mother's surname. My grandfather moved onto the property where we are still living on Fire Lane, and had an orchard and I suppose fruit berries and stuff like that, because some of the old trees originally had lagerberries growing up around the butts. So evidently he was growing berries in the early days. And getting back to the charcoal, Joe's grandfather, my Uncle Jim, when during the last World War and stuff like that, he had a Fargo truck with a gas producer, so he had to have charcoal to run the gas producer so he could drive around the hills. So the pride, I'm not sure how much of the property we're on now was clear when we first got there. I know a lot of it was still scrap. And some of the ground that Grandfather Fry broke up and planted apple trees on was about like that. And one patch of trees was so steep we had to just break by hand because it was just too steep to go on with anything else. And otherwise, I know they grew a few strawberries and stuff like that, as well as the fruit we took. I'm not sure whether there was any orchard on the property to start with, but it's mostly orchard at the end. So, thank you.
Thank you.
So we've talked about my whatever they were, great-greats. The first ones who came and settled on Smith Road, Loversall Road, and they were clearly gardeners. That's what they were doing. They established their farm. And then there's a bit of a gap in. I don't know what happened to that family in between. But when when my grandfather and grandmother got married, and they my grandmother had the east property, which is where they lived. There was a house on it. The Easts were living on that house, but my grandmother and grandfather built another house, what they called the new house, but it wasn't really new for a long time. But it was a new house, and that's where they lived all their lives, in that new house. And the land that was all around it, a lot of it was just hadn't been developed, and I know that, East had developed some of it and had been working the property a little bit, but I don't know how much. But my grandfather and then Dad as well, once he sort of left school, he helped to establish that property. They were still clearing land. My grandfather was clearing land for quite a while. He was doing that part-time, but he was also working part-time. He was carting timber as well, logging timber. And he actually also worked for Probus for a while, he did, and doing work there. So he was sort of working part-time establishing the property and part-time doing outside work there. And then, so as they established that property, it continued just as very much an orchard, market garden, which is what everybody else had. It was really like a great variety of vegetables and fruit, and that's what they grew, and that's how I grew up, helping Dad to pick all that stuff. It was fun.
So it's interesting in the coffee break, relatives and relationships, etc. I was talking about Easts to Jenny, because Jenny brought up that she's from the East side as well. And then in the coffee break, two East people, do you want to put your hand up, came up to talk to us. So this couple often turn up at our history group things, and their grandson recently won a big award for writing a story about Walter East. And if you look at our Anzac stuff, Walter East died at Gallipoli. So he just won, what was the name of the award?
It was their Premier's Anzac Award, and he's won a 2-week study tour to Vietnam, and he'll be there for Anzac Day. They used to go to the Middle East apparently, but it's not the place to go to.
So that's really good. We did put a link to it on our website. If you go to our Anzac section of our website, you can link off and read his report and see all the discussion about him winning the award. Thank you. I challenged everybody before we went to coffee to have a little think about women in your family. And one of the things that we note is that history often talks about the surname person, which is usually a man. And that's one reason why we wrote this book, to get some of the stories of some of the women of our district recorded. So we didn't write it to be a cookbook, although we did use a recipe as the trigger for getting into some of the women's stories. So I'm going to start first this end this time, which gives you lots of time to think up the other end, and talk talk something about your grandmother or your great-grandmother or your mother, it doesn't matter, and their role in your family and in the district.
Thank you. I actually can't go past thinking about my grandmother in that context. So Adela Pollard, Roy's wife, she was a very tough person, but a very strong person, and she worked so hard, and I've just never forgotten how hard I used to see her work. She would, in particular, they had cows, but back in those days there was nowhere, they had no pasture, or very little pasture to feed the cows, so she often had to take, like morning and night, she'd be taking the cows out in the morning to wherever she took, I don't even know where she took them, but to somewhere where they could feed, and then she'd bring them back at night time. And I can remember quite clearly lying in bed at night, because we were sort of in our, what we called our new house by that stage, down on, just right on Collins. I still call it Collins Road, but it's not Collins Road anymore, is it? It's Collins Hill Road, but anyway, sorry, Collins Hill Road. So our house was right there, and I'd often hear, when I was in bed, so it was late enough, I'd hear Grandma walking up. I'd hear the chains following the cows up the Bitterman Road, and I think, oh, it's so wet and cold, you poor thing, you're out there and bringing the cows home. She was a worker, and I don't really know what to say about her, except that her work ethic has stayed with me, and I'm sure, and with my dad as well. It was amazing, the work ethic that she passed on to us all. She'd be out picking, and yes.
She used to milk the cows by hand too.
She did used to milk the cows by hand. I never got the way of doing that, but she did used to milk them by hand. Thank you. And so she looked after them really well. I mean, I think she just loved the animals so much. But I also used to love going into the in the outhouse, the shedding around our house, and they had where she had all the feed for the cows and the horse and the chooks and everything else. And she'd let me help her measure out, you know, the amount of food, put it into the buckets for whichever animal or whatever we were feeding. And she just knew exactly what, of course she knew what they wanted, but she let me be part of that when I was very young. And I think that's good. And I just always remember her for that. And I think you're right, she wouldn't, because she didn't have the surname, Pollard, but she kind of held that family together for a long time. She deserves a lot of acknowledgement for that, I think. So,
And her maiden name was?
she was an East.
She was an East.
Yes. So, and we were just, who was I just talking to? Someone about the Easts, and they were saying, yes, that's right. And we were talking about another East who I think is a generation back, but another female in that family who was married to an East, a Charlotte, was it? Charlotte?
That's right.
Yeah, and a similar type of personality of just being able to walk for miles and miles and miles to do the shopping and everything. They were tough women.
And have 10 bags that she would go forward, go back and get more, go
Yes.
forward, go back and get more.
Because she probably used to go past your place, did
Yes,
she? You can remember her walking up, yeah. This is Charlotte we're talking about, Karen, yeah. Amazing. I couldn't do that. I don't know how they did it, but anyway. Good.
Just on that, taking the cattle up, I can remember my grandmother, when she'd come home from school, she said she used to have to go up Sam Allen's flat and bring the cattle back down to Lobethal Road.
Firstly, I'm not related to anybody in this district. I'd like to talk about my grandmother, Elizabeth Mary, I used to call her Polly. She was a very strong woman, not physically but mentally strong. And she raised 9 children. One of them, Llewellyn, who was 10 years old, went around, rode his horse around Deviation Road and must have fallen off and come back. He was dragged by the stirrups and he was deceased when he got home. Polly used to go to town to Adelaide every second Friday. She had 2 lovely white ponies and a little 4-wheel buggy, and somebody's told me one day that she went from Forest Range down to Burnside in 45 minutes. Which was a fair pace for a horse. And she used to collect a lot of antiques. She had a grand piano, and their house burnt down in '55, and it was full of antiques. And she was in the house when it caught fire. It started at the front of the house, and as the fire went through the house, she went from room to room to room, and ended up in the apple orchard out the back. The two white ponies were high-stepping horses, and quite often people used to stop her and want to buy the horses off her. And she was very good with the workmen and the payment and paid, and she was just a lovely lady. Thank you.
Great-grandmother Fry, I believe, and great-grandfather was a school teacher. She actually had a bit of a business. She had young Harry Caldecott. I've got it here, where that is here tonight. She's the people used to bring stuff there, and he used to take it to market for them. She was quite a strong woman in her way. My grandmother, well, she passed away before Dad was married. I don't know a lot about her. But I believe she would have been helping on the orchard as well. They had a bull, so they must have had cows as well. So I remember the uncle saying that the bull would get away and she'd take off after it. And somebody said to her, "The bull's going to kill you, Mrs. Fry." She said, "Not long as I've got this dog next to me." And well, my mother, she was widowed at 37, and she grew up in Adelaide. And yeah, she did a lot of fruit picking and beans and peas and strawberries and all that sort of stuff around the hills too. So I know she did a lot of work with farmers, picking beans and stuff like that. So pass it on.
Okay, just start off by saying that my grandmother was a niece, so we are related. But I think probably one of the most influential women in my life would actually be my mother. So she married my father when she was 18, and then soon after, and then we went to, Dad was a woodcutter, so we went up to, in Hollands Creek, back between Cuddly Creek and Lenswood. So we lived up this dead-end valley. We didn't have electricity or anything like that, so it was fairly primitive living. So to think about it, she was a young woman, really, and she didn't drive, we didn't have a car, so she was pretty isolated. So she spent her time probably looking after me and then my brother. But she was sort of the strong one of the family, really. Dad was, he was a fun-loving sort of guy, very easygoing. So, you know, no sort of dramas. He wasn't the one that disciplined us. Mum was always the one that chased us around with the apple twitch and things like that, and sorted us out. So there was that, and then sometimes when Dad would go and visit relatives, like I remember he used to go and see Roy and Lil Edwards around on Tears Road, and this is when we did have a driver, when we had a car, and Mum didn't have a licence, but she'd drive us home because Dad had a couple. Yeah, so she was a very strong woman that way, and also she involved herself in community things, like she was on the school welfare club, and she did 40 years of Meals on Wheels, so she's very involved with the church as well. So she's been a strong influence on all of us kids, really.
Thank you, Kevin. I guess my mother is probably the strongest influence on my life. Unfortunately, my grandmother, Plummer, my father's mother, passed away at a young age, and I probably wasn't old enough. I can vaguely remember, but not enough to have probably been influenced very much by her. My mother was a Sass, and the Sasses lived on Quarry Road at Noidoff, where the Boral quarries are these days. And her mother was a naval from Noidoff. And both my grandmother Sass and my mother, as I suspect with all women in this area at that time, worked very hard. You know, farm duties, caring for the house, caring for children, milking cows. You know, it would have been a full-on job. But both my mother and my grandmother instilled, you know, some basic life skills that, you know, we all rely on these days. And yeah, so yeah, I only have fond memories of both of them. My mother, she was a young lady during wartime. Her sister Della worked at the Onkaparinga Wool Mills, but my mother stayed home on the family farm to help produce milk and fruit and vegetables and everything else that was needed during war years. And so, you know, she did a lot of you know, that type of work and continued to do so on our property and our orchards and our packing sheds. You know, she continued to work well into her life.
John, you just forgot one thing. Mother packed a lot of strawberries for the East family too.
Oh yeah, right. There is an East connection.
Thanks, John. Now, this is an article from the Chronicle in Thursday the 9th of January 1930. Mrs. M. Rowley, who was my great-grandmother, Mrs. Mary Rowley, widow of Mr. Job Rowley of Forest Range, died on January the 5th at the residence of her daughter, Mrs. H. Norris, White Street, Henley Beach. She was born at Richmond on July the 16th, 1884. Her early days were spent at Richmond, Salisbury and Maiponga. About 1883, she and her husband took up garden land at Forest Range. Her kindly disposition won her many friends. Mrs. Rowley enjoyed remarkable good health up until about 18 months ago. She was the mother of 10 children, 7 of whom survive. Mrs. G.A. Whitty at Paynham, Mr. A. Rowley at Woodner, Mrs. J. Merchant of Cherryville, Mr. Fred Rowley of Forest Range, Mr. Ted Rowley at Glenelg, Mr. Lee Rowley of Norwood, and Mrs. H. Norris of Henley Beach. There are 33 grandchildren and 8 grandchildren. Mrs. Anne Clifford from Millicent and Mrs. Avis Mackenzie of New Brighton, New Zealand are sisters, and both of these ladies have passed their 80th birthday. And some information that I'd not heard of prior to reading the cookbook from the history group, but living in I understand it was a 2-room slab hut on the up over the range there, but Grandmother Mary pegged out possum skins, which were shot by the boys or the old chap, and this sustained what was a valuable contribution to the family income in the years that they were up there. And I thought, well, that was an interesting one. But obviously all the ladies must have been pretty tough. They produced a lot of children, all of the families. Yes, there was 5 children born in the Maiponga, Yankalilla area, 3 of which survived to come up to the hills. And there seemed to be, if you look at the birth dates, about every 2 years there was another child, and so it must have been pretty tough for those ladies. And also Mary, grandmother Mary, provided meals for the miners, and that was another part of their income generated whilst they were in Forest Range.
So before we go to the next bit, does anyone have any questions? Except if you're at East, don't ask if you're related to anybody. Does anyone have any questions that you want to ask any of that panel?
I'd just like to know how these women had their children because they were isolated. Did they just pop them out on the property, or was there wouldn't have been a midwife on Local Road for the plumbers up the hill, so how did they all manage? You know, compared to nowadays.
I'm going to get Cam actually to say something in that regard. And then you can answer it for your own families.
Yes, well, my maternal grandmother was the local midwife, and from time to time she would tell me about Joe Blow or Bill Smith or whatever. I delivered them, and she claimed she had no deaths, that all of her birth rates were okay. Quite often what would happen is that someone would arrive at the door, my wife's going to have a baby, and she'd pack a bag and spend the birth time with her and probably a couple more days at the house before she returned home.
Did she go off on a horse, or did she?
No, she would have walked.
Oh.
And so at that point in time, the doctor, the only doctor that was around was at Woodside, so he would have had to come on a horse, but she must have delivered a great deal of it. She in fact inherited that quality from her mother, who was also the midwife at Norton Summit.
Wow.
I believe old Mrs. Brown that lived up in the later years, Collins had the property on Plummer Road. She was a midwife as well. And when you got to the end of your life, she would lay you out, ready to be buried. So she did both ends of life.
So just another question. So do you think that your grandmother delivered Colin and Trevor, the twins?
No, they were at the hospital. They would have been the
Oh,
next
they were
generation down.
yeah, it's by then. Okay.
Pam's the Schultz. Okay, does anyone have anything about childbearing? Boys? Does anyone else have a question that they'd like to ask?
I'd just like to ask Jenny, did you hear any stories about Miss Swift, which I believe lived up just over the hill from where you grew up?
I don't remember ever seeing her or meeting her, but yes, I've heard lots of stories about her, and she lived in a very old, dilapidated shack, sort of almost across the road from where Roy and Della lived, across the other side and down a little bit, perhaps. Is that correct? That you lived down there somewhere. Yeah. I don't really know much about her, except I can remember hearing very young children say they used to be scared of her, but I don't know, I've never experienced that myself. Whether she mellowed as she got older, I don't know, but she used to walk a lot, I think, and yeah. But a real character of Forest Range. I wish I knew more about her, because it's going to make a good little story, wouldn't it? We've done it.
So, Margaret, do you just want to talk for 1 second to explain who Miss Swift was to people?
Okay. Well, I believe, like Jenny has said, Miss Swift I got interested. I actually did an oral history with Ross Pollard, and he was sort of talking about Miss Swift and how she used to walk down to McLaren Flat, I believe. Now, I don't know which direction or whatever she did.
Doesn't matter which direction.
Apparently, she would wear, it might be 2 or 3 dresses and have 3 different hats or whatever. And, you know, even how she used to cook, and I think she had sort of to sweep, might have been a branch off a tree or something, as she'd go sweeping her paths and stuff. And I just found her quite fascinating, well, the stories that I was hearing. And like you say, I think some people said that she was like a witch. I think she had really long fingernails and but yeah, but thank you for just sort of, yes, you did hear about it. Yeah, thank you.
We did get in contact with her family too, and they've got a winery down at McLaren Flat, and one of the wines is called Miss Swift's or her first name?
Priscilla.
Priscilla's. Yeah. So we've been in contact with them, and they've given us a photo that we've got in the Forest Range Hall of Miss Swift. My mum used to say that she only ever came out to vote.
Miss Swift's family were the Mannings, quite a well-known great-grand family in that part of the world. Question I had, Jenny and John both mentioned female relatives who milked cows. Now, I would imagine they probably produced more milk than they could actually drink. Do you know what they did with it? And I guess the follow-on from that is, did anyone here make butter or cheese?
Yes. I know we as a family got a lot of her milk. We lived on her milk, of course, but I do know that I presume it was the Amscol milk truck or something. The milk truck used to come along, I think, every morning, because I can clearly remember the milk, what did you call it? Milk cans. Churns, yeah, sorry. She had one of those sitting on the front veranda, which, not for very long, but the milk truck would come along and pick that up every morning or every other morning. So she sold some milk to I think it was Amscol. But she was also fairly generous in giving her milk away to people. And I loved it because, you know, you got the scalded cream on top, and it was just, you couldn't do much better than that. So, yeah, she kept a lot for herself, but the money-making side of it was that she did sell quite a bit.
Fresh milk?
Yes, fresh milk, yeah.
Well, I guess, like most families, there was always a cow, you know, to provide milk for the families. And in my mother's case, I can remember her making butter and skimming cream off the milk. But on the Sass farm, my grandfather Sass had a milk run where he ran a truck from Loberthal down the Gorge Road to deliver milk cans that dairy farmers had put their milk in to the milk factory in Adelaide. And at the same time, he also, the Centennial Hall at Loberthal was being built, and he was contracted to carry some of the building materials for the Centennial Hall back to Loberthal for it to be built. But unfortunately, the builder of the Centennial Hall went broke, and Grandfather Sass never got paid. So.
Does anyone have any more questions? Okay. So now I'm just going to throw it open. Families have lots of weird stories in their backgrounds. Colin's going. That they get from their grandparents, funny things that have happened, or they get from their uncle or whatever. So does anyone have any family stories they want to share? And I think you may have something to start us with, do you?
Thank you, Joe. It's a bit of a a story about the logging trucks. There was two major logging companies, the Percival's and Province, and they used to take the logs to Charleston or other railway stations, and they used to traverse Swamp Road. Because the logging trucks were so big and so heavy, they tore up the road something terrific. There's big ruts all up and down the road. So the people of the district got together and said, we're going to have a meeting and see whether we can stop this. And word went around by word of mouth to have this meeting, and because half the district worked for my grandfather, and so my two uncles put on their best suits and come down to the meeting, and everybody had to register at the meeting, and they all talked to my uncles, and in the end that 2/3 of the people got up and walked out, and so the meeting was cancelled. So,
you bullies!
I was looking at Old Bailey information, and there's a lot of William Proberts. William is virtually a family name. So I googled William Probert, and there in 1825 there was a William Probert who was hanged for horse stealing. We can't, because there's so many Proberts in Wales, we can't really say whether he was a relative of ours, because he's also mixed up with a murder. Two of his friends murdered this person, and he helped to conceal the body. And those two were hanged, and he got off because he turned to King's evidence. But whether he's a relative of mine, I don't know.
Probably. Who would like to go next? John's going to go. Okay.
Yes, just a related story regarding my grandfather Horace. He used to have a team of horses that he worked, and he helped construct the earth dam at the Millbrook Reservoir. That was an earth wall, and they obviously used horses with scoops to scoop up the earth to form the wall of Millbrook. From there, I believe he worked for Wick Newman at Cudley Creek, and then later on, again working his horses. The story is that he used to carry a single furrow plough from the Plummer homestead up over the range past the east property and down to Cherryville to plough for bungies. So yeah, that's just a short story about some of the stories that were handed on.
Okay, yeah, a few like little stories. Just speaking of it, can we talk about crimes now or not?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. Well, it turns out in 1937, my uncle Ned, that's Leslie Coulter, he had to go before the policeman at Lobethal because he damaged Uncle Len Coulter's fence. I'm not sure, I heard somewhere that he may have urinated on the shed, on the fence. But yeah, it's 5 shillings for damages, and if you didn't pay the fines, 3 days in jail. Yeah, so there was that. There was also a William Coulter, but I know Peter has a history of Western Australia with the criminal system over there. Sorry. So I was looking up William Coulter. It turns out there was a William Coulter who frequented the goldfields in around Kalgoorlie and Boulder, and he was involved in the death of a policeman, detective. He was actually hanged in Western Australia. But turns out he was from New Zealand and we're not related, which is good. Another interesting thing, which is totally unrelated to that, is that Dad, on Saturday nights, when he had him and Uncle Ned used to sit around the kitchen table. They would have a flagon of the Tolly's VO Invalid Best Port, and they'd be telling stories and things. Have the country and western cranked up fully on the radio, listening to that, and then it would come to the time where Dad had to get his racing axe out, because Dad, although he was 5'1", used to go into the local shows, like the Eureka show, in the wood chopping. He was very proud of his skill in wood chopping, so he had a racing axe, and he would get his racing axe out, and he would shave his arm. So this is how sharp it is. This is a ritual on a lot of Saturday nights.
After the flagon.
Well, yeah. We had a couple first. Anyway.
Colin, John?
Well, I suppose the question was, did the ladies make cheese and butter and so on? But I mean, I will remember my mother used to make butter. You know, the family milk cows right up until the early 50s, I suppose. Yeah, Mother, I don't ever remember her making cheese, but certainly butter, that was quite common. And there was a thing such as the butter pat, that as children, if one misbehaved, one got the butter pat.
Did you get the little indentations as well?
Well, yeah, well it was around the back, so I couldn't see. But just a story in relation to there were 4 members of uncles and aunts of my dad's, and that I remember, and I remember a family function where, and they were all in their 90s. There were Uncle Arch, my grandfather Fred, Aunt Nora and Auntie Agnes, and I've met a lady today Nora married a merchant from Cherryville, and so they were pretty tough, and the family have generally lived pretty long lives. But just a little story I can remember. It was a very hot day, hot summer's day, and I drove into Grandpa's down on the Swamp Road with the mail or something like that. My grandfather Fred, who was into his 90s, was on the roof of the house painting. Uncle Fred Jr. was in the shade on the veranda painting the window frames, but there was Pop up on the roof, 90 something, and it was a jolly hot day.
Bit short on stories.
Uncle Jim's story about your great-grandfather and the dog.
Oh yes, I remember Uncle Jim saying great-grandfather, the first on Rock Friday, used to walk to Woodside to church every Sunday. He was an Anglican, but because there was no church in Woodside, he went to the Presbyterian. And I don't know what happened to great-grandma because she was never mentioned, but he always took his old dog Bossy with him. Anyway, one Sunday the minister said he didn't want the dog in the church, so grandfather stood up and said, well, if the dog goes, I go. And half the congregation got up to leave with him. And the story was he hadn't taken up the collection yet, so he let everybody stay. So he the dog. I also remember Uncle, that's Joe's grandfather, he used to have the old truck with the gas producer, and he used to cut bees for the masons around the forest range. And he'd been up around in the valley at the other side of Manning for about a week. And they're coming up Palmer Hill, and he said, I wonder which mason was there, I said, did you hear that truck miss? He said, no, I didn't notice it. He said, a few minutes later, 3 white posts went under the bumper bar. He said it was the driver going to sleep with the truck missing. But they got home safely, so otherwise it's about it.
Sorry, I have to have my notes for this one. This is not a funny story like that. This is actually quite a serious but a beautiful story, really. And it goes right back to my dad's great uncle. So he was actually, this is Oliver Stanley Pollard, who was well written about in the monument book, the War Memorial book. But he had such an amazing story and sounded like such an amazing person that I think it's worth mentioning him. So Oliver was the son of the settlers who first came to Smith Road, Lobethal Road corner. His father died when he was 25, when Oliver was 25, and so he sort of took over the running of the property on behalf of his family. But in between all of that, he did a lot of community service, and so that's one thing I wanted to point out. He was actually he was secretary of the Forest Range Ag Bureau for a while. He was the secretary of the Fruit Growers and Market Gardens Association. He was politically active in the Labor Party. He was actually on the committee of the local United Labor Party for several years. So he was doing all of that while he was sort of basically running his property. But then when he was aged 30, so he was quite old, he enlisted in the army, and he was accepted. He was very excited to go and serve in the army, and we know this because if you've read that book, the monument, what's it called, sorry, Forgotten Monuments, yeah. There are some beautiful letters that Oliver wrote to his mother, Susanna, on his voyage over in the ship on the way over to wherever they ended up over in the war. And you read the letters, and the relationship between him and his mother was just incredible. So by this time, the mother's still at home with no husband, single because he's died, and with still children and I guess grandchildren to look after. So the letters are there to read, but I just thought I'd read this information out because of you people who are such great fruit growers and everything. He's written in one letter he wrote in 1916. He's in a place called Durban. I do not know where Durban is, but over there. And he's talking about the fruit that he can see for sale in the windows in the shops in Durban. So I'll just tell you what that was. So apples are 3 and 6pence a dozen. The green ones looked like French crabs. Cherries are 1 and 6 a pound. Oranges are a penny each. Mandarins are 30 for a shilling. Grapes 1 and 6 a pound, and some plums that looked like Satsuma plums. So he was quite happy to relate what he was seeing back to his mother. And then there was another part of the letter where he wrote another letter in 1917. This is a letter to his mother. I'm sending 2 samples of apple wrappers that we get here. So they must have got their apples already wrapped as they bought them. So I'm sending these apple wrappers back to you. I would like you to send the Skookum one. Does that mean? I don't know what that means. But anyway, I would like you to send the Skookum one on to Fred Green. I sent him one of the others before. 2.5-inch apples. A penny halfpenny to 2pence each here, but they are real good apples, Jonathan. So I thought, there you go, that's a little bit about what was happening overseas. But those letters, back and forwards between him and his mother, are just amazing to read. And sadly, he didn't receive the last letter that his mother wrote to him because he was killed in action overseas in the war. So that's really a sad thing. But I just think what an amazing person and a wonderful relationship that he and his mother had.
So just pulling back do a plug for our Anzac service. So we have a 10 o'clock Anzac service on Anzac Day, and Jenny's agreed to be one of the speakers on behalf of the Pollard family for the Anzac Day service this year. All right, looking at all these fine young boys and girls, they all would have gone to Lenswood Primary School. Some of them would only have gone to Lenswood Primary School. Kevin, you went to a Cuddly Creek School too?
No.
You didn't?
No, just all Lenswood.
All Lenswood, right. So I'm going to ask you, and I'm going to start with you, John. How did you get to school? And what's your best or worst memory about going to school?
Can you give those to me again, please?
How did you get to school from your place? And what's your best or worst memory about going to school?
Oh dear me, I have to think about the last part of that. But I've always considered that 7 years riding a bike up the Swamp Road, and the Swamp Road in those days wasn't quite the road that it is today, were the best years of my life. We had a tremendous fun in all weathers. But yeah, and I think so. In the old language, there are photos. There are photos at home of my older sister Pam, who was in grade 7 the year before I started school. And in those days, children starting school the next year after Christmas went to the school for a week or some few days at the end of the year previous, and there was a photograph at home of Pam donking me on a parcel, sitting on a cushion on a parcel carrier up the Swamp Road in that pre-Christmas period. Yeah, they were good days. I can remember. I can remember well. That I suppose it's the freedom that we had as a generation that our kids and our grandchildren certainly don't have. But I mean, you left home at 7:30 or 8:15 or whatever it was in the morning, and you got home before dark, and in between times, Mum and Dad didn't have a clue where you were, and I think I have thought about that, and I think we were left to our own devices, and whether you cut your leg or whether you fell over and got gravel rash or whether you drowned in the creek was purely up to you. And that's something that and we learned, we adjusted, we handled that, and none of us came out too badly. And but it's something that I look at my grandchildren, and that they miss this. Yeah, I'm struggling to describe that, but we learned to look after ourselves and accept responsibility for what we did, and it's something that the current generation certainly, I think, is struggling with. And it's something else I forgot to earlier, but I will remember Mrs. Pollard, your grandmother, and her cows. And the edges of the road were kept nice and tidy. There were, in those days, and I remember the milk can, and I was thinking, I'd not heard about Miss Swift for a long time, but and I'm sure that I actually remember Miss Swift living in that little cottage diagonally opposite your grandparents' home. There was a story, but I don't think I'll go into that. It might that I did hear, but I don't know whether it's right or not. So I think I'll pass. The story that I heard a long time ago was that the lady that lived there was a part of a very wealthy family, and she was not maybe 100%, and that maybe she was 99 or 98%, and that the family deposited her up in the hills on that property to look after herself, and I understand that was something that happened in those days, and that era wouldn't be allowed to happen today. So, but I'm not sure whether that's right or not. No.
Yes, well, I guess like most children of my age, we walked to school initially. I think we were living on Plumbers Road when I first started school, and we'd walk around from the ford around the bends to the school, and as John's was saying about his grandchildren, that the freedoms we had and the things that we wouldn't allow our grandchildren to do. Well, I certainly wouldn't allow them to walk around the bends to the Lenswood Primary School. And I'm sure Miss Langmead had a few panic attacks when we used to walk from school around to the Mission Hall for our concerts. That's what we did. There was a concert we held, so we'd walk around. But later on, when Mum and Dad built their new home, we were able to catch Grover's bus. So fortunately there was a bus that came through at about 9:15 in the morning, and one that returned to Adelaide at about 3:30 in the afternoon, and that made things a lot easier.
Did you like school?
Well, I was going to relate the story. I can still remember the first day my father took me to school. Mum and Dad had a little black Hillman, and Dad opened the back door for me to get out, and I scooted to the other side of the... We did that for some time before he eventually grabbed me by the scruff of the neck and took me inside. But I don't have a great recollection of whether I enjoyed school or didn't enjoy school, but I certainly enjoyed the teaching of Miss Langmead. She was... I guess we all, as children going to school, we recall teachers who we remember, and there's probably only a handful of those that you remember through your whole school life, but she certainly had an impact on me.
Yes, Miss Langmead was my teacher as well.
Hands up if Miss Langmead taught you.
They were good days. I've got a few memories of going to school. I think one of the first things I remember is, like John said, I used to live up Plumbers Road as well, and I was walking to school. I feel like I was on my own, and there's a corner just before the straight that goes up towards Greens, like one of the last long straight bits. And I went around the corner, and I found a £5 note, which in those days it's a lot of money. And so we took it, went to the shop and things, but no one claimed it. So Mum actually used that to buy my first Lenswood blazer, which I was very proud of. So that was good. Yeah, it's about one of the last times I sort of found anything. Anyway, that was good. And also, later on, when I was riding the bike to school, I actually developed the skill of riding from the school right around to the ford, no hands. We're pretty proud of that. Yes, and also, as well as Miss Langmead at school, we had Mr. Flint. Remember who had Mr. Flint? I know you did. So Mr. Flint by name and Flint by nature. That was the one. So, and as far as I know, he had a sort of serious car accident, and he actually had a plate inserted in his head. So when the weather changed, Mr. Flint's nature kind of changed as well. He was a good man. One of the other problems was that I always seemed to be sitting next to a person called Robin Mason. Anyone here like Robin Mason? And he would always get me into trouble. And like, it seemed like, I know one day we were swapping Coke bottle tops, because we had one of those like flip-up desks on the flip seat, wooden seat, so we had this packet of Coke caps with the footy players in the middle, and for some reason the caps all got knocked on the floor. So then we had to, so up the front, boys, bend over, yardstick, there you go. That was nasty. I could go on for a while. Those kind of adventures. Mr. Flint, he was a tough man. We got caught going up into the pine forest one day. So everyone into the office, line up. As you come out, hold your hand out, get the cuts. And I thought I was his favourite student as well.
Yeah, but you was up pinching pears up at Herb Robinson's, that's what you
No, I was just like an innocent sort of bystander. I just followed the others.
It was Robin Mason, wasn't it?
Right, yeah, Mason. He hit me in the nose with a tennis racket. Go on forever.
And that's why you became a teacher.
Yeah, I think I enjoyed school. I still remember the first day. We used to catch Craig's bus to the later years on a push bike, but first day I was assigned to one of the big boys to look after me and show me around the school. It was Dean Brock's younger brother Brian, who were still friends. Yeah, so later years, like I said, we dirt around the bikes. I left school one day, well I don't remember leaving school, but one of those big gum trees down by Lenswood Irrigation didn't actually move when I hit it. So I don't remember leaving school until I woke up at the doctor's.
Was that when you could ride the bikes down the hill?
Yeah.
Before they stopped it, maybe it was your fault they stopped it.
No, we landed on the bike.
Yeah.
And we used to, later years, if you were good at your spelling test, you could go down and pick up the mail when Mrs. Fountain. I can still remember her looking out the window and saying, "Good morning, boys." And we say, "It's all right, Mrs. Fountain, serve all the rest first, we've got plenty of time." And we're lucky we got back at 10. Told her in and we used to take Mrs. Green's mail in on the way back. Another day, Lynn Green's passed away now. We went down through Stan Green's orchard, jumped the creek, and Woodshills, as everybody knew, had a patch of turnips just up the track above where the Telstra Judith said. No, we got turnips, fresh turnips to eat on the way back to school. What else? Yeah, I remember getting the cane like back here. We had a hailstorm. We were told, no going out and making snowballs out of hailstones, but guess what? There was a whole line of us with cold hands, get the cane. So, otherwise, no, I think it didn't hurt me to, the cane probably didn't hurt us, that's for sure. But, I do remember once, now these days, because the mains water comes to the school, the children are not allowed to drink main water. I remember, I don't know what year it was, we were complaining that water taste, the tank had a taste. And I said, there's nothing wrong with it. And a month or so later, they had the tank cleaned. And they removed the rest of the possum. But it didn't hurt us, did it? Thank you.
Thank you.
I didn't go to Lenswood Primary School, I went to Forest School. That was the name of the school when I went to school. And we used to catch Layton's bus in the morning, and that was the mail bus. And they were flash coaches. And they used to come home by the Gravers bus. I remember in the Monday mornings, I am an Australian, I love my country, I salute the flag. And after assembly, we used to march in with the drums and triangles. Oh, I never ever got to play the drums. I was very disappointed about that. I enjoy school. I only got the cane once, and Dad bought the school bell in Port Adelaide when he was president of the committee, and I was throwing rocks out one day, and I got caught by the headmaster, and I had to front his office. So that's the only time I got into trouble. We usually have a fete or a fair every year, and we had a donkey. And Dad took the back seat out of his FX hole and loaded the donkey in. Took it down to school and took all the kids for a ride, which was a lot of fun. So I enjoyed going to school there. Thank you.
Yes, well, I went to Lenswood School as well, and also caught Graves bus on the way, and Graves bus home again. So, and when I first started, because I was the oldest in the family, and so it was just me. So at that time, before Mum and Dad built their new house in Forest Range, we lived in an older, older house up the top of the hill. So I had a fair way to walk down this track, down the road, across the road by myself, and wait in front of Frost's place for the bus to come. And I remember sometimes I used to feel very grown up doing that, because I thought, it looks so good. But other times I used to be quite scared because I was by myself. Anyway, I did it, I survived. And then when, I remember when Glenda, my next sister down, when she started, so I had to take full responsibility for looking after her as well, and that was a bit of a burden. But anyway, we obviously did it okay because we all survived that. So that was good. I clearly remember when Miss Langmead came to the school, yes, and it was wonderful to have you as our teacher, thank you very much. But I do remember, and I think I've told you this, I do remember when you came to school, at this time it was very cold. It was very cold. And Miss Langmead used to love standing in front of those heaters. She would not move sometimes. She would stand in front of those heaters. And she said, I can't believe how cold it gets here. Poor Miss Langmead. Obviously you survived that as well, so thank you. But thank you for being our teacher. You were amazing, thank you. What else is there? I remember that it might not have been the first day of school, but it was very close to the first day of school. And we had a teacher who probably shouldn't remain nameless, but we had those little tiny blackboard things that we used to have on our desk, and we were given plasticine to play with. And we were told to make something out of the plasticine. I can't remember what it was. But I was there trying to make, art was never my thing, but I was trying to make whatever she wanted, the teacher, and the next thing she comes down and she bangs on the desk, really bang, what are you doing? You're not really doing it right or something. And I was bursting into tears, and that was I was always scared of her after that, so I didn't enjoy that much. But mostly school was good. Lenswood School was good. Oh, did you?
This is...
Oh, yeah, that one. Anyway, so that's okay. She was doing her job. School was good, and I've always loved learning, I suppose. So on my own way, I was learning, and it was good, and it was lots of great memories. So.
This is not about Lenswood School. This is about going to Oakbank. My next brother up, Errol, who is no longer with us, was a right little terror. He was constantly kicked off the school bus. And at one stage he got kicked off the bus in front of Brockhouse. He walks around the back of the bus. The back of the bus had a luggage rack. He pulled the luggage rack down. He's sitting on the back. We're watching out the back window. It gets nearly up to Brock's where the bus turned around, and off he hops. Another day he got kicked off, and somebody stopped and picked him up, and as he's going past the bus, he's going like this. I don't know how many times he got kicked off that bus.
Just as a matter of interest, I'm not sure how many students are at the school these days. Anybody know?
57.
But when my father went to Forest School, Lenswood, there are about 110 students at the school. I'm not sure how many teachers there would have been in those days. When I went to the school, I remember there was 107 students, and Colin, we must be the oldest here. But there were 3 teachers. Miss Ball was my first teacher. Mrs. Pointer in the middle room, and I've been struggling to remember who the headmaster was when I started school.
There was a Mr. Moore, but then...
There was a Mr. Moore,
But
yes.
then we had 7...
But that was a bit later
We
on.
had 7 filled in for a while.
But then when my children went to that school, I think there were 70 odd kids, about 6 teachers, Miss Langmead helping out, Mrs. Stafford, sorry, and things. But I thought that was an interesting point to think how things have changed in those years.
John will probably remember, we had inkwells, and pen with a nib. You went out through recess and you came back and somebody into the floor and put it back on the desk. So the next time you started writing in the book, you had a mess.
Okay, does anyone have any final questions for the group up the front? And does the group up the front have any final stories or information they want to share with us? Kevin, stop laughing.
I know. We could go on forever, I know.
Yeah, well, I guess I mentioned earlier that Edward Plummer had arrived here in South Australia in 1840, and it's well documented that Edward Plummer was a convict, and he had spent 7 years in Tasmania before coming to South Australia. He was born in Langham in Suffolk in 1800, and he had been convicted of stealing a goose and some goslings, and then of stealing a chook, and I think it was after the second conviction that he'd been sentenced to transportation to Tasmania. He initially served some time on a hulk in Plymouth Harbour because prisons were full in England in those days. They were trying to get rid of all the undesirables. But then he was sent to Hobart. He was never held in prison in Hobart or Port Arthur. He spent his 7 years as a farm labourer at Longford, which is not far from Launceston. And when he got his ticket of leave, I believe he paid his own passage to South Australia. The photograph that I spoke about earlier of the old colonists was taken on his arrival here in 1840. So yeah, he certainly had a colourful past. I guess the other colourful person within our family was Charles Edward Plummer. His name appears on the War Memorial at the Central Sports Field or Recreation Ground. Charles Edward was the brother of my grandfather Horace, and his sister Sarah Schultz, Jenny and Roger's great grandmother. But Charles he'd stolen his father's horse. It's said that he'd stolen his father's horse and was on the run. He finished up at Cunnamulla in Queensland, where he enlisted into the army, and he was placed in the 2nd Light Horse Battalion. The 2nd Light Horse Battalion left Australia in early 1915. went to Egypt. While he was on board and in Egypt in camp, he informed his mother, Elizabeth, that he had enlisted under an alias, under a false name, and that name being Albert Anderson. Wendy and I travelled through Cunnamulla about 6 years ago. We decided, if there's usually a war memorial in all the old towns in country Australia, see if we can find any reference to Anderson or Plummer, whether there. And we went into the Shire office. There was no war memorial in the street, but in the Shire office they had a great copper plaque with all the names of people who had enlisted in that area. And sure enough, Albert Anderson's name was there on that plaque. Anyway, Albert Anderson was sent to Gallipoli in early August of 1915, and he was killed on the 7th of August at the Battle of the Neck. And I think that was quite a savage battle in the Gallipoli War, and he was buried at Queen's Post. And so there's been quite a couple of quite colourful characters in the Plummer background.
So is there anyone else going to own up to a convict? Oh no. Well, we won't look at any Staffords.
All day.
All right, does anyone have anything else?
Yeah. We talk about timber cutting, and nowadays we look at it and say what a destruction and desolation of the countryside. But farmers needed their property cleared so they could grow crops, so they could feed the country. And people needed to build houses and build dams and walls and things. But when a tree was cut down, very little of it went to waste. With these 60-foot logs, the limbs were cut into 4-foot lengths, and they were stacked in a cord. A cord of wood is 4 foot high, 20 foot long, with 4 foot lengths of log, and they were sent to kilns, brick kilns and bakeries and that, to keep the fires alive. So, and the rest of the cut up for firewood, but very little was wasted. And stringy bark, being such a good, clean, straight grain, made excellent shingles for roofing.
I dare say the privates would have done the same, but I remember my Uncle Gordon saying that Littles from the roadway came onto the car park just by Harris Road one evening with about a 5-ton Austin with a jinker behind it and 40-foot poles that they were taking to Keith for logging scrub. Just your grandfather would have done the same. In the morning they came there, started the truck and left it run for quite a while. They went off at the car park, onto the bridge, put it into second gear and it died. So they went almost to Lenswood School in 1 gear before they could get it into second, but the load was so great. And they were going to Keith. So imagine the fuel economy on that truck.
Okay, am I stopping? Kevin's going to do one last
Just one more thing. It's a bit light-hearted, one though. I'm just talking about nicknames now. So, my father, they used to call him Ghoulie. Does other people remember that? Ghoulie, yeah. And I was trying to work out why he's called Ghoulie. And then, before I said how Uncle Ned got into trouble with the police, actually the first policeman at Loberthal was Mr. Ghoulie. So it was Tweedvale in those days. But so in 1937, Mr. Ghoulie was the policeman at Loberthal, and the family had some dealings with Mr. Ghoulie. And Dad was the kind of boy that I think would get teased a little bit at school. People would stir him up. And he would say, I'm going to tell Mr. Gooey. So then he became, that's how he got called Gooey, I think.
I had quite a different concept.
Did you? Well, yeah, I should hear yours sometime.
All right, thank you everyone for coming. It's been a lovely afternoon, and thank you in particular to our storytellers who've shared their family stories and some humorous ones as well. That's been lovely. Peter hopefully has it recorded. So once he's cut it a bit, we have a YouTube channel that we put our videos onto. So we'll put out on Facebook or on our website when it's recorded, and it'll be up on our YouTube channel. All right, thank you very much everybody.